Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the podcast. Today we have Derek Jones. Derek is a very special guest with quite an extraordinary background. Let's see here. Derek, thanks for jumping on. And where are you calling from today?
I'm calling from Ashburn, Virginia, just outside of DC.
Amazing. So I was reading your origin story, and the detail that stopped me was that you started your first business in 1975 while you were in the Marine Corps. That's not a side hustle. That's a whole different level of ambition. What was
Actually,
happening?
yeah, actually, I started it way before my first business was when I was 7 years old.
Well, you can add on top of that once I get to the question here.
But anyway,
Uh,
go ahead.
what was happening in your head at 20 years old that made you think I'm going to start a company? Plus, you can also elaborate on the 7-year-old business.
Well, it literally really started with that back then. I realized pretty early on, and I think it was from watching my father was a former commander in the Navy, and when he got out, he went the corporate route, and he was traveling all the time. And to my mom was she worked as well, but she was more of a stay at home mom than in the workforce. But I just saw how much my dad did, and I saw I guess the biggest lesson for me was when I graduated from high school, that first year, they moved to Brazil for a job opportunity for my father, and it was huge. It was serving on the board and serving as, a senior financial officer in a multi-billion-dollar company that owned the largest brewery, in Brazil and the second largest lumbering operation in Brazil. So, as you can imagine, it was a pretty big deal. But then I also observed, certain events that took place that resulted in them almost losing everything because the Brazilian government came in, nationalized the company, and when that happened, they seized everything. And so my parents had to literally buy their way out on the black market and find their way back here to the U.S. And it was a mess. And then just over the years, I had heard other horror stories of people, that IBMers, for example, that had things work for years for the company and then end up with practically nothing. And I just I didn't want that. And I knew that by having my own company, while there was a lot I didn't know, I knew that at least I had the independence of choice. And for me, that was critical. So I made that decision early on that when I got out of the Marine Corps, and plus, even before the Marine Corps, I was already, I had a side job with my brother. We were painting houses was one way we, paid our part of our tuition to university. And, as I mentioned, I had my first company when I was 7. I mean, I was doing appliance repair in my local neighborhood. And quite frankly, I didn't repair that many appliances, but I had some really nice neighbors and I made some money and I learned a lot. And so all of that kind of carried with me, and so when I got out of the Marines, that was my first objective was to get a company set up.
Excellent. So you went from the Marine Corps to appliance repair to GPS machine control for construction years before anyone else was doing it.
Yeah.
To global CTO at a company working with Microsoft and Apple across 25 countries. Most people have one career. How do you think about that arc?
Well, mine when I look back at it, I mean, it all seemed perfectly natural at the time because, I started my first company. I happened to be working in the heavy construction field. I was doing software development, and I made lots of good money doing that because I took advantage of the time when it was just as PCs were rolling out. When I got out of the Marines, it was 1981, and PCs, started to emerge in the market in 82, 83, something like that. And so I was literally able to take that ride, so to speak. And, but I was in a very specific niche in terms of working with heavy construction. And what happened was I met a couple of guys that owned the largest direct sales organization for a company called Spectra Physics, which was at the time they were the gorilla in the construction instrument space. The founder invented the original pipe laser, which sits in the Smithsonian Institute, and they basically built and are manufactured and delivered various types of construction instruments. And what ended up happening is they got themselves in a little bit of trouble because they kind of messed around with their inventory, carrying certain stuff on an inventory that should not have stayed on inventory to get advantage at the bank. And because they were a direct sales operation of Spectra, Spectra literally one day came in and took the store over. And what they did is one of the guys ended up going back to the headquarters and working directly at the headquarters in Dayton, Ohio, and the other one stayed there running the store, but had basically two white shirts from Spectra on either side of him, basically managing the entire operation, making sure that none of that nonsense was going on. Well, when that happened, the guy's name that went back to Spectra was a guy by the name of Pat Butler. There was already an ongoing conversation at Spectra that, hey, we're a manufacturing company, but there's this idea of software, a way to differentiate things through software that would save us a lot of money and give us a lot greater capability. And so they originally hired a guy out of NCR to run their software division, and the guy was a catastrophic failure. And it was and not so much because the guy didn't know his stuff, he did, but he didn't come out of the construction industry. And most of the employees at Spectra back then were all former contractors, former, employees out of the construction industry. And so there was just this culture mismatch. And so what ended up happening was Pat ended up getting into the ear of the CEO saying, well, you really need to talk to this guy, Derek. This is the stuff he's been doing. And so they literally flew me back to Dayton and they ended up offering me a job. And it was a high paying job. And for me at the time, I had done enough as an entrepreneur. I wasn't real wild about going to work for quote unquote the man, but I had just had my second child. And it was like, I really could use the stability in terms of the income because as an entrepreneur, your income is always stable, especially in the early days. So I took the job. And it was one of these contracts where I had 1 year to basically turn things around. And if I did, I could write my own ticket. And if I didn't, they'd show me the door. And I was very fortunate and was very successful in what I did. And so, long story short, I ended up becoming in fact, I think it was the youngest VP in their corporate history. I became the VP of R&D. And I worked very closely with the head of the machine control group. And together, we basically pioneered, this concept of a robotic machine control system, which is something they had been talking about internally. It's not like, it was my brainstorm of an idea. They had already been talking about it, but I had been working with a guy in California who was my mentor, who had been experimenting with it with another contractor in California. And that contractor actually had a patent that Spectre was very interested in. So it just brought me in even tighter. So to make a very long story short, I ended up becoming the VP of R&D after a couple of years and became the head of the development group that essentially pioneered this particular project. And so we worked from roughly 1993 all the way up till 1997, and we rolled this thing out on a test track in Dayton, Ohio, in 1997. And it was at the time, it was the world's first fully autonomous robotic machine control system. We were able to get it down to literally millimeter accuracy. It was unbelievable, but that was in combination with terrestrial lasers, and other sensors that allowed us to do this. And so it was a wild time. It was probably one of the best times in my career. And we had a great team, and we were working around the clock trying to beat Caterpillar and Komatsu and all these other players that were pursuing the same dream, and we beat them all. And so yeah, and then I ended up staying on. We went through a bunch of mergers and acquisitions. We ended up ultimately wholly owned by a company called Thermo Electron, and they took over in '97 when we rolled this thing out on the test track, and I ended up staying on another 3 years. And then I left in 2000. I got approached by the chairman of the board of a company called Next 15 Communications Group, which was a global PR firm that was challenged by the fact that they kept reinventing the wheel every time they would acquire another brand because they were purely in tech. And so, as an example, they represented Microsoft in Asia, but they also represented Apple. And so the two couldn't be in the same brand. And so they would spin off another brand. But when they did it, they essentially reinvented the wheel every single time. The things that they did in terms of the infrastructure and the computing systems and the process, everything was basically rebuilt from the ground up as opposed to leveraging the knowledge that they had acquired from doing it the first time. And so I was brought in to solve that problem. And so we built a knowledge management solution and we did a number of other things that the end result was in 2002, I was named by Computer World as one of the top 100 CIO CTOs in the country. And I only ended up staying on for a couple of years because 9/11 happened, and when 9/11 happened, the budget dried up, and I didn't wanna sit around. That was my the entrepreneurial side of my brain started kicking back in, and I was like, "Yeah, okay, I'm done." And so I went back to being an entrepreneur, and I've been one ever since. So, long
What a
story.
story. Wow. Okay. So you sold your IT service company for $11 million and then chose to start again. Most people would have just stopped. What made you?
Actually, what I wish it was that good. I had received an offer at 11.2 million to buy out my managed services company up in Boston. I started in 2007. I grew it to 4.5 million in 3 years. In 2011, I got the initial offer, and it was from a former partner in a previous business that I had in Vegas. And the guy was, he was just this brilliant guy. He was mentored as a kid by Oppenheimer, literally. He was an executive at Motorola. He led the artist team at Motorola, and he was the inventor of the original paging system going way back when. And anyway, his name was Mark Hewitt. And so Mark had come up with this massive idea around the concept of a smart city. That what he wanted to do was he was going to buy up 25 companies that had key assets in various areas so that he could literally launch onto the market before anybody could react or do anything. And he had gotten the backing he needed out of investors out of the EU. But what ended up happening was, in fact, I was the smallest company of the group. And the reason he was buying me was because one, he wanted me to run his platform group because we knew each other. And two, at the time, my clients were Sony, Canon, Alcatel, radio frequency systems, some really name brand companies, and he wanted that on his slide deck. And so we made the deal, but then what happened was the Greek finance minister came out publicly and said he was going to default on his loans to the EU. This is back during the '08 financial crisis, right? And so when that happened, all of his investors retracted. Well, then Mark came to all of us and basically said, "Well, give me a little bit of time. I'm going to find another investor." And of course, none of us really believed he was going to be able to because the amount of money was just unbelievable. But sure enough, within a month, he flew all of us down to Boca Raton, Florida, and we were brought down to meet the new investor. And we had a big celebration and planning and all this kind of stuff. And then I flew back to Boston to celebrate with my staff. I had 23 employees at the time. I threw a big party for all of them and spent thousands of bucks. And then within a month, Mark had to fly out to Vegas to meet with the guy to sign the papers. Well, as he gets off the plane, he's greeted by the FBI as he gets off the plane. And it turns out that the guy that he had found to be the investor was part of a group that had been skimming off the gambling boats down in the Mississippi Delta region and had been doing it for apparently years and had amassed almost $500 million in stolen assets. And so they were going to use this deal apparently as a way to launder that money. And of course, the FBI had been tracking these guys for a while, and so they used Mark. They wired him up, and to bring a long story short, those guys are now sitting behind bars in federal prison. And but the end result for me was I lost my company. I lost 1.5 million personally, and I had to start all over again. So it wasn't like I earned $11.2 million and went off and celebrated and started a new company. It was I lost everything and I had to start another company because I didn't have anything left.
Wow. Wow. What a story. Thank you for sharing. All right. So the Computer World Premiere 100 IT Leader recognition in 2002. What was happening in your career at that point that put you on that list? And what did that moment mean to you?
It meant a lot. I mean, it was actually pretty funny because I had just gone through a pretty serious divorce, and the only thing I had left was I had my because my ex-wife had taken off with the vehicle and cleaned out the bank account, and the only thing I really had left was I had enough money to go out and buy a motorcycle, which I did. And so that's how I was getting around. And so and then I was working for the PR company at the time. And the reason for the award was because of the work I did at the PR company, because I put together their entire strategy. It was very successful. And part of it included the build out of a knowledge management solution that was accepted by both Microsoft and Apple. It allowed them to continue their operations. And it was a pretty big deal. And so that's why I ended up being awarded the award, and actually was asked to be a featured speaker at the conference when they rolled out the award. That was in 2002, I think it was. Yeah, it was about 2002 when the actual award ceremony took place. And yeah, so to me, it was a huge deal because I was in line with, the other award winners at the time was the CIO from Federal Express, the CIO from Delta Technologies. I mean, some pretty big name brand companies that were very impressive folks. And so it was just it felt really good, to be honest. And it was just kind of to help justify all the work that I had done. And then, after that took place, I had already left the PR company because I left them right after 9/11. And so, um, but I was able to take that, and that was part of my pitch deck when I started my next company. So it was very helpful.
Okay. All right. So you've described iGlue as a startup with over 5 decades of experience. That's a great line. But what does it actually mean in practice for how you work with clients versus what a true startup would do?
Yeah, to be honest with you, I actually struggled for a while because what happened was, I've been doing marketing most of my life because as an entrepreneur, you do everything, right? Or you do a lot of stuff. And if you're smart, you get as quickly as you can to a place where you're not doing everything. But, so I learned to do marketing. I was doing marketing when I worked at Spectra. I was doing marketing when I had my first company, which was Syntech. But that's never where my passion really lied. My passion was on the technology side. I mean, I just loved working with technologies, all kinds of technologies. And so what ended up happening was I started a company. The first one was called Leatherneck Tech, and it was a play off of the fact that I had been in the Marines. Nobody really got it. In terms of the brand. And the thing I also learned was that I had no real credibility in the digital marketing world because nobody knew me. And so I had to go about building credibility. And so one of the first things I did is I went to work with a guy that was kind of a mid-level marketer, and he had some really, fairly decent products. So he hired me to basically train his. He had about 400 agency license holders. So he hired me to train and coach his agency license holders, which I did for a couple of years. And then one of the things that happened was he and I had a very different opinion in terms of customer service. And I actually had a bunch of them coming to me complaining because of some of the things that were going on relative to his customer service. And in fact, one of them ended up leaving and she ended up going over and signing up with Go High Level at the time. And so there came a day where she literally came back to me and said, "Hey, I've signed up with Go High Level." And I said, "Well, what's that? Tell me about that." So she introduced me to Go High Level, and of course, this was roughly 2018, early 2018. I mean, Go High Level was really just getting their start, and so I was really impressed, and so I signed up, and that's when I severed my relationship and moved over to Go High Level and started building on it. Well, one of the first things I did was I put a group together of some of the people I had been coaching, and actually this group is still together to this day. And we started meeting, we started planning some things that we were going to do together, and so I started building on that. And what ended up happening was one of the people in that group was a woman that had a PhD in adult education. She was a curriculum design expert. And I was really kind of, because I'd been doing the training and coaching, I was kind of interested in that side of things. And so we ended up combining the companies. And so I rebranded and kind of took over her brand and it became Top Of Your Game Marketing. And so we did that for about a year and a half, almost 2 years. And, it just got to a point though where she was going and where I was going were two different places. And I also was really struggling with the whole marketing side of things because things were just not quite yet resonating for me. And so I ended up giving her brand back and I went back to using iGlue digital marketing. But then what happened was I finally came to terms, with really what I was passionate about, what I was interested in. It was on the tech side of things. And so I rebranded for the last time. It was iGlue Digital Services. I dropped marketing out of the name. Even though I do provide marketing services, I'm more focused on the fractional side and the technology side of things. And I didn't want to get lumped in where somebody saw iGlue Digital Marketing and just assumed, well, this is just another marketer. I wanted to be separate from that. And so I formed iGlue Digital Services. And so that's what I do today. So my focus today really is in four areas. It's being focused as a fractional CTO. helping small to mid-sized companies with their tech stack. It is doing working with companies in their digital transformation and helping them to really understand and leverage the available technology today to do things in a better and more progressive way. And then, of course, AI comes along, and I had been working with AI going all the way back to '93 when we were working on the robotic machine control stuff. And so I thought, well, this is interesting. And then one of the things that really triggered me was seeing all these companies that were suddenly throwing up placards, basically proclaiming AI expertise when I knew they had none. I mean, they were marketing companies a day before, and then all of a sudden they became AI experts. And so I was like, okay, you know, I got to do something with this, and so I started to focus on working in AI. And so the way I approached it though was I have relationships that go back, decades. And so one of the first things I did is I wanted to have a really strong development arm. Granted, I started my career as a programmer, but I don't. Well, I'm doing more programming now than I've done in quite a few years. But when you grow up in the corporate world, you kind of take this management track and you get away from doing as much coding as you would normally do. And so I had kind of gotten away from it. And so what I ended up doing was I reached out to 4 different companies that I knew of and started exploring the idea of putting together white rate label relationships with some of the best development companies that I could find in the world and companies that I had some kind of connection with, and ended up putting me in a position where I had over 2,000 developers. I still do to this day. I have, over 2,000 developers available to me, and everything from machine learning, AI, you name it, these guys can do it. And so it put me in a position where, and there's one other piece. I ended up meeting a guy that came out of the DC market. He came out of the AI industry, was a DC here in the DC market for a period, and then he moved to Utah. And he started an AI training company, and he put together a really great training platform called AI Ambassador. And his concept was to go into mid to enterprise companies to train, their top people on, how to think about AI, how to approach a development project in AI, how to, because it's really very different than, just building a software product. And so he put this whole training program together. And so we formed a bit of a partnership. And I realized it was a great way for me to potentially enter with into a company by offering the training and then being able to have the resources that could actually deliver on the projects that they were interested in. And as an example, one of our clients is a kind of mid-level, it's a wholesale parts supplier, and they realized that they were losing about 20%, at least the owner estimated they were losing about 20% of their orders because the way they operated was they had an inside sales team and an outside sales team, and the outside sales team would email their orders into the company along with the RFPs. But the owner was realizing that about 20% of the orders weren't going through. And he couldn't figure out why. He knew it had something to do with the email system, but he didn't know what. So he hired us. And what we did is we ended up developing an AI agent that essentially managed all of the email. So when the email came in, we processed the email. Anything having to do with sales or RFPs basically went straight through to a management team that was there to help train the model, vet the orders that were coming through, and then eventually we did the integration with their ERP system and CRM. And so that went so well. Number one, we found out that they were losing more money than they realized. And two, they turned around and hired us to do another phase of the project, which is we just signed a contract. So we're now engaged in the second phase of that project. So, very, very cool stuff. And the strategy was working. And so then what I did was I said, okay, the best way for me to grow is through partnerships. And so I just really started focusing on finding strategic partnerships that worked in key areas that I wasn't directly working in that could bring me into those areas and that I had something they didn't have, they had something I didn't have, and it was a marriage in heaven. And that's how I've grown the business. And that's how I continue to grow the business.
That's how you're supposed to be growing a business.
Yep.
I mean, Built two distinct tracks, one for SMBs using LinkedIn Genius and Go High Level, and an enterprise AI ambassador program that builds internal champions and connects them to 2,000 development resources. How did you arrive at that two-track model, and what's driving the biggest results right now?
The model just kinda came to me, and it just came to me simply because of, I've been working in the space for so long, and I've seen how other companies over the years, how they leveraged, these key partnerships and how they looked for them. And, like, a really simple example would be, you form a partnership with an accountant because the accountant obviously is keeping books for all these businesses and probably a lot of businesses that you would never touch, but the accountant touches them because they do their taxes every single year, right? So now I form a partnership with that accountancy. I provide value to the accountancy. They open up their portfolio, and I now have access to all these companies that I wouldn't otherwise have access to. And in exchange, they get benefit, financial benefit for my engagement, as well as some other non-tangible value. So that's a really simple example of how I look for these opportunities. So I've got a bunch of them now, and it works very, very, very well. And so now what I'm doing, however, is I'm almost 70. I'll turn 70 this year, and I realize I've been working incredibly hard for like the last year. I mean, literally 7 days a week. Sometimes I'm up at 3 or 4 in the morning, and I work usually until about 7 at night. And I've realized I can't keep doing that, so decided to start doing a little bit of a swing where now I'm kind of getting back into doing a little bit of programming. And I've developed two products. One that I'm just about finished. It's about a week and a half away, and I'm really excited about it because I think it's going to be a huge hit because it's a product that I have a product right now that's called Link Genius, which is basically a LinkedIn campaign automation platform, not unlike others that are already in the market, like Dripify, and there's another product called Linked Helper, and a bunch of others. Anyway,
Can you explain a little bit more like what it does and what's the
yeah, that's what I was gonna get into. So, the difference between those products and what I'm doing now is this particular product, what I wanted to be able to do is I wanted to be able to have a client be able to pull down, for example, 5 or 10 of their best customers, bring it into the system, have the system enrich those records so we have all the data that we need, LinkedIn profile, job title, etcetera. And then have the system do a combination of things to define the ideal client profile. One is to profile those companies that they've imported. Two, to write a prompt that using AI to help discern what that ideal client looks like. And the combination of the two produce that ideal client profile. Then take that ideal client profile and run it up against LinkedIn and pull every record from LinkedIn that aligns with that ideal client profile. And then basically rank them, in terms of the percentage match. So if you look at my system today, it brings down 25 records at a time, and it gives, ranking, usually the first 5 to 10, 15 records will be 100, let's say I'm looking for somebody that's a fractional CTO. These will be people that are actual fractional CTOs and blah, blah, blah. So that's the first part. The second part then is to be able to create a campaign that's not just a connection campaign. This is a campaign that will actually you craft a strategy based on your ICP, you develop a strategy, you use that strategy to then generate a sequence of messages, and then you take those messages, and then what I'm doing is I actually write those messages back to Go High Level, and they become part of Go High Level's email template system. That allows me then to go into Go High Level, have access to all of those, and incorporate them as part of the workflow system in Go High Level. So I can now build workflows in Go High Level that are incorporating those messages and then push them right back into the software. So now the software has two ways to basically reach out to LinkedIn. One is directly through the software. Once I build that campaign, it goes into an outreach component of the system that will then directly message people on LinkedIn that align with my outreach strategy. Or two, it's part of a campaign that comes directly from Go High Level through my software directly into LinkedIn. So 2 ways to get to LinkedIn with direct messaging that's been built by the system that aligns with that ICP. I don't need Sales Navigator. I don't need, I don't have to spend, although I have the system to do the direct outreach through Link Genius. With this, it's a bigger, more richer way of basically doing a direct outreach campaign using LinkedIn to help you build your business. And so that's the system I've built.
Sold. Let's talk about after the call.
Well, I've actually, it's amazing. I've got 7 companies already signed, lined up to do case study for me and whatnot. I'm happy to include you if you want to, if you'd like to do it. I'd be delighted.
Yeah, let's talk about it after the
Sure.
podcast.
Not a problem.
All right. So you keep coming back to the idea of never stopping trying to help people. After 50 years of building companies, where does that drive actually come from?
Wow. That's 2 things. I was really fortunate as a child to be raised by. My parents were married for 65 years. They had an incredible relationship, and we were, directly benefited from them. They were amazing parents. And so, they were never short on reminding us of, we could do anything we put our minds to. They were very, supportive in that regard. And, I grew up believing I could do anything, as did my brothers and sister. And so that was one part of it, seeing my father's work ethic. I mean, both my mother and father grew up on a farm, and, they did not have, they didn't come from a wealthy family, but they did extraordinarily well in their own career that allowed us to have, some of the most incredible experience. I mean, I had experiences like, for example, when I was growing up, my parents insisted that we have a well-rounded education in terms of we didn't go to private schools. They insisted we went to public schools because they wanted us to have that exposure. We had to take an instrument, and we had to take voice lessons. We they had us going to church every Sunday, and we had to sing in the church choir and all that kind of thing. And when I was growing up, I took piano, so my instructor was the director of the Pennsylvania Ballet Company when I was growing up. And when I went to Syracuse initially, and when I went to Syracuse, I went to Krauss Conservatory, and it was directly because of the experience I had growing up. And so the one part is just the ethics and the drive that was instilled in me by my parents, and watching their role model. The second part was because of the failures that I have had, I learned very early on the critical importance of mindset. And as a matter of fact, just before I started this version of my company, which was about now a little over a year ago, I was at probably one of my lower points because I things just up to that point just weren't resonating as they are now. And I went through a period where, we had COVID. Believe it or not, I had a safari company in Tanzania that went belly up because of COVID. And so I lost money there. I got caught in a really horrific scam, which cost us a bunch of money. And then I had, what was it? Oh, well, and then during that period, my mother died, my father died, my niece committed suicide. I mean, I went through some really horrific stuff for several years, and it got me to one of the lowest points that I've had in my life. And then I had the benefit of a friend of mine referring me to a guy by the name of Eric Lofholm, who's a sales trainer, very wonderful guy, very good sales trainer. He was one of the top salespeople for Tony Robbins for a number of years, many, many years ago. He has his own international sales institute. And I got into one conversation with him, which was all I needed, basically reminding me of the importance of mindset. And that changed everything because it basically brought me back to where I had been previously mentally, and everything has changed because of it. So, for your listeners, you know, mindset more than anything else is everything. If you have the right mindset and and just refuse to give up, you will ultimately succeed, but you've got to have the right mindset.
Wow. A lot of people, I don't think they even have an idea of how much you're talking went through. But that's pretty incredible. And sorry for all the loss in the family. I'm
Yeah,
sure that's yeah. Okay. About the mindset, I guess we'll come back to that in a bit. But that's a very strong statement. You gotta just keep moving. You gotta
yeah. One of it's a little bit funny, but one of the things that was there was a I don't know if it was a meme on social media, but there was this clip where this little girl was singing, "Don't stop, don't give up,"
Yeah.
and that just, I mean, that just hit me. This little girl saying, "Don't stop, don't give up," and of course, my conversation with her all kind of came together and resonated. It was just, and so I would just continuously repeat in my head, "Don't stop, don't give up," and it works.
Wow. That's quite important. That's quite powerful. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah.
All right. You've been writing about agentic AI in your newsletter, calling it no longer optional, a competitive advantage for SMBs, for SMB owner who hears that and immediately feels overwhelmed. What's the first thing you'd actually tell them to do?
The first thing I tell anybody to do is, number one, relax. Two, you do not have to jump into the fire. When you start with AI, you want to take something that is simple, repetitive, that is consuming, that if you just solve that one thing, it would buy you X amount of time. It would save you X amount of money. In other words, there would be some clear outcome from your accomplishing whatever that task is. And just focus on getting that one task done. And you literally build like building blocks. You build one little block at a time because to me, it's kind of like, how do you instill a new habit? Well, you instill a new habit by doing something repetitively over and over and over again until it just becomes a habit. I mean, there's more formalities, there's more formal concepts around this, but that's the basic idea. Is just if you want to get something to become a habit, you just have to repeat it over and over and over again until it becomes a habit. And so one of the things you have to do is you have to acclimate to this new world, and you've got to get your staff to acclimate to this new world, and you can't shove it down their throats. You can't shove it down your own throat. You got to take it in a little bit at a time and just take one piece at a time and build it one piece at a time, one building block at a time.
Wow, thank you. That's powerful. Let's see. You watch technology go from GPS machine control and construction to AI agents that can run entire workflows autonomously. What's the pattern you see in how business adopt new technology? Like, what separates the ones that get ahead from the ones that get left behind?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it actually reminds me of a time when I was back at Spectra. We hired this marketing guru to come in and do an assessment at the time, and this was the guy that had written the book that talked about. And I'm gonna have to apologize because I can't remember all the terms at the moment. But the idea is that you've got this technology curve and there's this gap, and you've got to get across that gap. And everybody, follows along this curve to some point, but a lot of people get stuck at that gap. And how do you get across that gap? Right. And, so one of the things that I try to look at when I'm working with this stuff is, I'll give a practical example. I had one of the things I used to have to do is I used to have to do these tech assessments where you would take a look at the overall technology in the company and do a regular assessment of it so that you understood where things were at. And were things improving? Were things, were there problems in certain key areas? Were there things that needed to be replaced and this, that, and the other thing? And there wasn't a good, clean way to do it. I mean, it was a combination of Excel spreadsheets and Word documents and this, that, and the other thing. Sometimes you'd pull logs from the technical logs from various applications on the IT side and so on. So one of the first apps that I ended up building more recently was a what I call Stack Score. So it's a tech assessment app, and what it does is it looks at 46 different points of measurement. Everything from the architecture to teams and processes and risk and security and so on. And so that you take those various 46 points and you measure them. And then there was a section where the assessor then writes a narrative that details out things like the architecture, like the risk, like the overall strategy, and so on and so forth. And then the system takes all of that and essentially generates a report. And the report is, first, there's an executive summary report. There is a report on the architecture, a report on the risk, a report on the overall roadmap, and the roadmap from a perspective of to remediate the problems. And then finally, basically, the overall recommendation of what to do. And so you run this assessment, and then, next quarter, you run it again. Because you store off the results, and then the next time you come in, you load up the previous results, and now you run the assessment again. And of course, the system knows that this is a second run on the assessment, and it acts accordingly. That whole approach is kind of talks to my approach to things. Um, in other words, I looked at a problem that was a problem for me for years, and I know that there are fractional CTOs that are out there that have to deal with this, and I know that there are CTOs and CIOs that are out there dealing with this every year. And so I knew there was a market for it. And so there was an opportunity to build a solution that did what I used to have to do, but really struggled doing, that now makes it, something I can do in 15, 20 minutes. And it's incredible. And it's all because of, my being willing to adopt, technology. One of the, coming back to your question, one of the big differences today is I've been through a few super cycles. For example, the adoption of, when PCs first rolled out, that was a super cycle of technology. The difference is when that happened, there was a lot of time for organizations to respond. There was a lot of time for individuals to respond, to go get training, to go learn about, the different things and where they might have some interest and where they might be able to leverage existing skills and into something even more, and so on. There was plenty of time to respond. The difference today is that time is not there. Things are moving so fast today that this super cycle is happening at a speed that the world has never seen. And it's being driven in a bit of a madcap way. And, people are not going to have time if they don't jump on board. And unfortunately, this is going to be a major I think it's going to be a major disruptor, for most people, if they're not willing to just jump in. It doesn't mean that, you know, I don't see it necessarily. I mean, yes, there will be people that will lose their jobs, and there'll be, just wholesale job replacement with robotics and AI. But where I see it in a bigger way is like how I use it today. I mean, I use AI every single day. It has made me massively more productive. I get an incredible amount done every single day. Stuff that, had I done it my original way, that could have taken me months to do, gets done in days. And it's just staggering. And so, I think people just need to take a deep breath, relax, and look at, okay, what is, like, back to, what I was saying for somebody getting started. Take a look at your business and what are some of the things that really consume your time, that really get in the way of the progress in your business, and then learn how you can use AI and apply it to solve some of those things. And if you need to hire somebody like myself, somebody else, but there are lots of resources out there. There's tons of resources out there to learn yourself. You don't have to spend big bucks in order to understand this stuff, but find a way. I mean, for example, I used ChatGPT almost exclusively for quite a while. Now I use Claude almost exclusively, and
Almost, yeah, exactly. Almost exclusively.
I
Yeah.
don't use anything exclusively because I always like to keep my hand in all the different LLM models to see what they're doing and how they're different, and what I need to be aware of. But I'll tell you, I mean, I'm just stunned every single day by what I'm able to accomplish with Claude. And again, it's everything from writing proposals to putting the reseller agreements together to building sales funnels to literally coding out the funnel itself, to building these products that I've talked about. They were all built using Claude and so other technologies as well. But nonetheless, I mean, it's just staggering what you can do. And I know of people, for example, that have no background in coding whatsoever that are actually finding some success today by at least, understanding basically, and using some common sense in terms of, okay, I want to do this. What are some of the things I need to think about? And then asking the AI for guidance getting that guidance and being able to respond, and then basically iterating back and forth with the AI, to get what you need. The biggest area I think, where people tend to get a little bit messed up though when they're doing that is in terms of context, because obviously when you open up a chat as an example, the more you stay in that singular chat, the bigger and bigger it gets, the bigger and the bigger the problems that you potentially can get within that chat. So you kind of break it up and need to understand a little bit how to break that up. But it's just, to me, it's just staggering what you're able to accomplish with these platforms.
Yeah, let's see. The AI ambassador program is a fascinating concept, training internal MVPs rather than just selling a product. Where did that idea come from and what does it look like when it works the way it should?
Yeah, that actually, I've got to give credit to where credit is due. I mean, it comes from a guy by the name of Kevin Williams, and Kevin is the founder of Ascend Labs AI out in Utah. And again, he came out of the AI industry, and he realized that that companies were simply not going to be successful if they weren't properly trained, and not trained necessarily. I mean, he does provide AI training, but not necessarily on the AI. It's more about strategy and approach and how to think about things. And so they basically, built this training. He actually built this training over a little bit over a year, I believe. And he's actually just come out with a newer version of it. They've also come out with a version of ethics in the regulatory environment. And that's been a big hit because, obviously that's another issue, especially if you're going to be working not only in the US, but overseas. But for me, as I looked at it, okay, this is the best way to be able to enter a company, to be able to say, look, we know you read the press, you know that a lot of companies are not achieving ROI. And they're not achieving ROI on these projects because they're not going about it the right way. They're not thinking about it the right way. This is a training platform that will help you with that. And then in that process, we have the resources available for you if you so choose to help you implement what you ultimately look to implement. Of course, you can do this internally yourselves. That's fine too. But I just find it as a really good way. I've always found it. I take a kind of a consultative kind of strategic approach in sales. In other words, I like teaching people. I like working with people. I like helping people to understand things. And I've always found it a really good way to help build credibility, to build trust, and then ultimately be able to secure business because I've taken the time to give. Service, 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 as far as I'm concerned. The more you're able to pay attention to how you serve your clients, the more reward your clients are going to pass back to you. That's simple to me.
Okay. Thank you for sharing. So you're actively transitioning from iGlue Digital Marketing LLC to iGlue Digital Services Inc. You call this significant scale up in size and scope. What's changing and what's driving the timing of that move now?
Several things. I mean, one, AI is moving very rapidly, and definitely significant improvements on that front. And then, the other thing is aside from AI itself, it's been me. My mindset has changed. Two, I've gotten really excited and animated again about what I'm doing because I love what I'm doing, and I've been able to uncover some really great partnerships. And because of that, everything is just escalating and getting faster. I mean, I'm closing typically 2 to 3 deals a week, and that seems to only be increasing. And I'm starting to move upscale again, and those upstream up to larger and larger companies, which I also like. But one of the reasons why I go after larger companies is because I like working with really small companies. A lot of companies that don't normally get the kinds of services they need because most businesses won't provide that service because there's just not enough money there. Well, by doing what I'm doing, it puts me in a position where I'm actually able to work with these smaller companies because, these larger deals help offset some of that cost.
Fascinating. Okay. What's working really well in Sangaloo right now? Where is the momentum?
I'm sorry, what was the last question?
What's what's working really well inside igloo right now? Where is the momentum?
So the momentum right now really is I've got 2 partnerships in particular that are really triggering, and bringing a lot of business in. and the recent couple of applications that I've built, I think are going to trigger a really significant response, especially the LinkedIn platform I'm building. I think that's just going to be it's going to be the probably the application that's going to allow me to kind of pull back a little bit, be able to bring in some additional resources. Because my goal is to ultimately bring in additional resources, so I'm not the one that's doing everything every day. I want to be managing and building the business. I don't want to necessarily be working in the business other than on those things that I really like doing.
Okay. Now, on the other hand, what is the friction you're actively trying to solve?
Let me see. What is it I'm trying to solve?
So first question was, no, what's working really well? And there's good momentum. And the second question was, where's the friction? And
So the friction is right now really more than anything else is just in my time and being able to really effectively manage my time. That really comes down to being able to very effectively leverage AI so that I could get a lot more done in in each day and keep it managed without burnout.
that's a quite a valid point. There's just so much happening with AI space. It's just difficult to even sleep.
Yeah.
Uh,
I hate to do this to you. I have a 5 o'clock, so I'm gonna have to bring this to an end, unfortunately.
what I wanted to do is a little follow up.
Yeah,
So
that'd be fun.
I'll send you a link.
Okay,
Find about sounds good.
that'd be great. Yeah, look forward to it.
Okay.
All
Thank
right.
you for
Yeah.
podcasting. Bye
Yeah.
bye.